Out of the pool, now. That strap isn't regulation, and you're endangering everyone else. Patricia hand clamped around Emily's arm before I could even stand. My daughter, 12 years old, gasped and flailed as Patricia yanked her toward the steps like she was some criminal instead of a child at practice. Parents froze, whispers rose, and the sound of splashing died into silence. I rose slowly, every muscle tight, and dropped my truth like a stone in the water. That strap you're calling dangerous, I designed the safety specifications it meets. You just picked the wrong battle. The smug look faltered on her face, just for a second, before she snapped back into her performance for the crowd. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. I stepped closer, voice calm. Daniel Carter, City Safety Inspector, structural engineering background. My wife swam in this pool before she passed, and my daughter's only here because I promised her mom she'd keep swimming. You want to talk about danger? I know what danger looks like, and it's not on my daughter's shoulder. Patricia's lips pressed thin, but she didn't release her grip until Emily wrenched free and bolted to me. The sting of chlorine hit my nose as Emily buried her wet face in my shirt. I could still feel my wife here, on the bleachers where she once cheered, in the shallow end where she'd taught kids to float. After the funeral, it was the pool that gave Emily structure, purpose, a way to breathe when grief weighed too heavy. Losing access to this place wouldn't just take away a hobby. It would rip open a wound we were still stitching shut. Patricia didn't see any of that. She saw a rule to wield, a title to flex, a chance to prove she owned us all. The board gave her a clipboard, and she thought it was a crown. But she didn't know me. She didn't know the quiet fire that comes from watching a 12-year-old fight back tears in the same water her mother once called home. I held Emily tighter, forcing my voice steady. You've embarrassed her enough. Step away. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some parents turned their heads, others watched with wide eyes. No one brave enough to interfere. Patricia smoothed her shirt, smiled for her audience, and walked back toward her chair like she'd won. But I knew different. She had chosen the wrong family, in the wrong community, at the wrong moment in time. Where are you watching from? I set Emily on the bench, pressed a towel around her shoulders, and made myself a silent promise. Patricia thought she had authority on her side. She thought pulling a child from the pool over a strap was just another way to remind us who was in charge. What she didn't realize was that I'd built my career on holding people accountable when lives were at stake. And now, she'd crossed into my arena. I look back at the pool, the ripples already fading, the surface smooth again, like nothing had happened. But I knew this was only the first splash in something much larger. Patricia had declared war on the wrong person, and before it was over, the entire neighborhood would see exactly who she really was. The park near the pool looked serene at first glance, with trimmed hedges, flower beds along the walkway, and a gazebo where parents gathered with their children. Yet beneath the carefully maintained surface, unease hung over the families who lived in Oak Glen. People spoke in cautious tones, scanning for Patricia before raising complaints or even letting kids play too freely. It wasn't just about Emily's pool strap. Patricia's shadow stretched much farther, and today that truth became unavoidable. Two mothers were chatting near the swings, and their voices carried more frustration than gossip. One described how Patricia had issued a violation letter over her son's skateboard ramp, citing unsightly equipment. Another admitted she'd been fined 3 times in the past month because her trash bins weren't angled uniformly along the curb. The rules weren't new, but Patricia wielded them like weapons. She seemed to decide at whim who was guilty and who was ignored, her friends within the community always skirting consequences. Michael stood at the edge of the playground with folded arms, absorbing the pattern in silence. He wasn't looking for a fight when he'd moved his family here. After his wife's passing, Oak Glen had promised stability, a clean community where his children could heal. But the park where Emily once laughed freely now carried tension, every family second-guessing simple joys. He recognized the weight of selective enforcement. Once you spot it, you can't unsee it. Patricia was turning neighbors against one another, some becoming enforcers by proxy, others retreating into silence. The gazebo offered the most revealing moment. A small group of board members huddled there, their clipboards resting like shields. Patricia sat among them, presiding with smug certainty. She pointed toward a neighbor's garden gnome, shaking her head in exaggerated disapproval. A few laughed nervously, while one man, Robert, the community's treasurer, looked down, fidgeting with his pen. Michael noted the hesitation. Robert wasn't comfortable with this circus of petty power, though he said nothing. For Michael, it confirmed what he already suspected. Patricia's grip wasn't absolute. What made it worse was the symbolism standing right there in the park. At the far end was the oak bench dedicated to Michael's late wife, inscribed with her name and a small bronze plaque. Patricia had already called it non-conforming during a board walkthrough. She hadn't forced it out yet, but her comments were a warning shot. Michael's children visited that bench weekly, tracing their mother's name with careful fingers. It was more than a piece of wood and metal. It was their tether to her memory. The idea that Patricia could one day tear it out, citing uniform design, chilled him more than fines or violations ever could. The weight of injustice rippled outward. A retired veteran had been ordered to remove his flagpole for being too tall. A young couple received threats over a front yard flower arch. None of these so-called violations harmed property values. They harmed spirits. Michael realized Patricia wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was controlling it. Every confrontation was calculated to remind homeowners that they lived under her gaze. And yet, the fear wasn't total. Michael saw hints of resistance buried beneath the compliance. Parents lowered their voices, but their eyes burned with resentment. Children whispered about the HOA lady, as if she were a character from a cautionary tale. Even the landscaping crew, usually neutral, shared wary glances when Patricia passed by. The ground was fertile for change. It only needed someone to step forward. Michael wasn't a politician, but he knew systems. He understood how rules could be twisted, and more importantly, how they could unravel when inconsistently applied. His engineering background wasn't just about machines. It had taught him how to spot weak points in structures, even human ones. Patricia's enforcement wasn't uniform. It was selective, biased, and sloppy. That was the crack in the foundation. Standing near the memorial bench, Michael let the weight of his wife's absence steady him. Patricia could target Emily's pool strap, find neighbors for flowers, and humiliate children at the swings, but she couldn't erase memory or silence truth. He wouldn't allow her to extend her reach any further. Not here. Not in this park where his family's pain and healing intertwined. Around him, parents gathered their kids as the sun lowered, and the board meeting dissolved into idle chatter. Patricia strutted toward the exit, clipboard tucked under her arm, satisfied with another day of petty governance. But Michael's eyes weren't on her anymore. They were on Robert, still seated in the gazebo, staring into the distance as if questioning his own silence. That was where the next battle would begin, finding the one who could be moved, the witness who could tip the scales. The clubhouse smelled faintly of old coffee and fresh paint, the kind of place designed to look welcoming, but always felt staged. Patricia stood at the front, clicking through a slideshow about community standards, like she was leading a military briefing instead of talking about mailbox heights and lawn colors. Every slide was another weapon sharpened to keep people compliant. I leaned against the back wall, watching. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to see who else was cracking under her pressure. That's when I saw him. Mark Feldman sat 3 rows from the front, treasurer's folder balanced, on his knees. He wasn't like the others, who nodded along or kept their faces carefully blank. His fingers tapped the folder like he was trying to drum out his nerves. When Patricia declared that new administrative fees would be applied to repeat violators, his jaw tightened just enough for me to notice. He didn't raise his hand, didn't speak, but the discomfort rippled through him in small, involuntary movements. Shoulders rolling, eyes darting down to the floor, then back up at her with a shadow of resistance. Patricia noticed, too. She turned toward him once, lips curling in a smile that wasn't a smile at all. It was a warning. Fall in line, or you'll be next. Mark looked down at his notes so fast it almost hurt to watch. But I caught the flicker of something. Shame, maybe, or guilt. The meeting droned on. A neighbor asked about funds set aside for repairs, and Patricia brushed it off, claiming, "All finances are in order." I saw Mark flinch again. He pressed his thumb hard into the folder's edge, like he was trying to ground himself against the lie. His body said everything his mouth couldn't. He knew something. When the meeting ended, neighbors filed out quickly, relieved it was over. Patricia lingered at the front, basking in her authority, while I stayed back, pretending to check the bulletin board. Mark gathered his papers slowly, too slowly, like he didn't want to walk past her. His hands trembled just enough to make the pages rattle. I stepped into his path deliberately. "Rough meeting," I said quietly. He looked at me, startled, then glanced toward Patricia. "Yeah, these always are." His voice was flat, but his body betrayed him. He shifted his weight, rubbed the back of his neck, couldn't hold eye contact for more than a second. I lowered my tone. "You don't look like you're buying what she's selling." Mark swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed, but he didn't answer. Instead, he clutched his folder tighter, the edges bending under his grip. I realized then it wasn't just discomfort. It was conflict. He was carrying something heavy, and it was tearing at him from the inside out. Patricia's heels clicked across the floor behind us. Mark stiffened instantly, shoulders pulling back like a soldier snapping to attention. He forced a polite smile and muttered, "Good night," before slipping past me and out the door. I let him go, but I'd seen enough. His silence was louder than any admission. He wasn't loyal to Patricia, not fully. He was trapped, torn between duty and conscience, and that made him valuable. Walking home through the quiet streets, I replayed his body language in my mind, the restless fingers, the clenched jaw, the refusal to look her in the eye when she lied. Mark Feldman might not know it yet, but he'd just revealed himself as the weak seam in Patricia's armor, and weak seams, under the right pressure, always tear open. I wasn't going to push him. Yet. Not tonight. Trust wasn't given. It was built, brick by uneasy brick. But I made myself a promise. When the time came, I'd be ready to catch his conscience when it finally broke free. Patricia thought she had complete control. She didn't see what I saw, the storm brewing quietly inside her own treasurer, and storms, once they break, don't ask permission. 2 mornings later, the letter was waiting for me like a snake coiled on the porch. Thick white envelope, HOA seal stamped at the top, and Patricia's name signed at the bottom in that sharp, slanted script she loved so much. I tore it open right there in the cool air and scanned the words. Final warning: non-compliance will result in escalating fines, potential lien placement, and legal action if unresolved within 10 business days. It wasn't just about the tree anymore. Patricia had expanded the list: fence alignment, mailbox paint, even the way my trash bins were placed after pickup. It was a net cast wide enough to choke me no matter which way I moved. I folded the paper slowly, deliberately, though my pulse was racing. This wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of war. Later that day, I took the letter to my workplace, an engineering firm downtown. I wasn't about to give Patricia the satisfaction of confronting me on her turf. At my desk, surrounded by the soft hum of servers and the distant clatter of keyboards, I spread the notice flat under the fluorescent lights. The language was intentionally vague, but I could see the trap buried inside the phrasing. Patricia wasn't just threatening fines. She was building a paper trail, setting the stage for legal leverage that could corner me into compliance or strip me of my rights. As I read it again, I noticed something odd. The penalty schedule she referenced didn't match the one outlined in the HOA's bylaws. The dates were off, the sections skewed. Either she was bluffing, or she was manipulating the rules outright. I felt the corner of my mouth twitch into a grim smile. Patricia might have thought she was tightening the noose, but in her arrogance she'd left threads dangling, and threads are meant to be pulled. At lunch, I stepped outside, phone in hand, and called my neighbor Victor. He'd lived here longer than anyone, and while he wasn't a fighter, he had an eye for detail when it came to the association's history. "Victor," I said, lowering my voice, "tell me, have you ever seen the board update the penalty schedule?" There was a pause, then his weary laugh. "Update? They haven't done that in years. Last official change was, 2014? Patricia waves papers around, but half the time they don't match the records." My chest tightened with something close to satisfaction. That was the second slip I'd caught in less than a week. The kind of discrepancy that could unravel her authority if I stacked them high enough. I went back inside and sat at my desk, staring at the letter, until the words blurred. Patricia was escalating, but so was I. I wasn't going to bend under her threats, not when I could see her cracks forming. That night, as I set the letter down on my kitchen counter, I felt the shift inside me solidify. This wasn't about saving a tree anymore. It was about stopping someone who thought power meant control, who believed fear was the only language people understood. She wanted me cornered, silent, and obedient. Instead, she'd forced me to commit. I wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. I stayed late at the office that night, long after most of the engineers had packed up and gone home. The lab was quiet except for the low hum of the servers and the occasional tick from the HVAC system. I spread Patricia's warning letter across the workbench and brought up the HOA bylaws on one of the monitors. Side by side, they didn't just look mismatched. They looked like they'd come from two entirely different worlds. I've spent a career writing specifications that had to survive regulatory scrutiny. One misplaced line, one sloppy misreference, and a whole project could collapse. That skill, attention to technical alignment, was something Patricia never expected me to use against her. I traced through her so-called penalty schedule, line by line. The fines she claimed to be enforceable didn't exist in the official bylaws. Section 4.2 she cited was actually about landscaping height, not mailbox colors. Section 6.1 was about quorum requirements, not lien authority. It wasn't just sloppiness, it was deception, dressed up as procedure. I pulled up the timestamp on the bylaws version filed with the county. Last updated, 2014. Victor had been right. That meant Patricia's enforcement letters, the ones that had half the neighborhood trembling, weren't backed by anything legally binding. She was playing poker with an empty hand, and most people never called her bluff. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing the bridge of my nose. The realization came with equal parts satisfaction and anger. Satisfaction because I had proof, clear, measurable inconsistencies. Anger because I thought about Emily, still shaken from being yanked out of the pool, and how many other kids or parents had been bullied into silence by this same fraud. Patricia wasn't just power-hungry, she was reckless. I decided to test the limits of her bluff. Using the firm's secure printer, I made side-by-side comparisons. Patricia's letter on the left, the official bylaws on the right. I highlighted each contradiction in glaring yellow. By the time I finished, I had 6 solid mismatches, enough to plant a seed of doubt in any official setting. As I gathered the papers, my phone buzzed with a message from Victor. "Careful, Daniel. She doesn't take challenges lightly." I stared at the text, my jaw tightening. I knew Victor meant well, but silence was what Patricia fed on. If nobody stood up, she'd keep rewriting the rules until the entire neighborhood lived under her thumb. I packed the documents into a plain folder and slipped it into my bag. This was no longer about defending against fines. It was about proving that Patricia had been wielding authority she didn't actually possess. And if I could prove it once, the whole facade would start to unravel. Walking out to the parking garage, I felt the shift in my chest again. For weeks, it had felt like Patricia was pushing me deeper into a corner. But now, I had leverage. Real, tangible leverage. The kind that didn't require shouting matches or endless board meetings. It only needed daylight. As the automatic lights flicked on overhead, I paused at my car. I could almost see the path forming, get the right eyes on this evidence, force the contradiction into the open, and watch Patricia's carefully built tower collapse under its own weight. I thought of my wife then, of the afternoons we spent at that pool when it was new, back before Patricia turned it into her stage for control. I thought of Emily, clutching her towel after being humiliated in front of neighbors. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just building a case, I was reclaiming a promise. That tree in my yard, the pool she was thrown from. These weren't just property lines. They were memory lines, family lines. I slid into the driver's seat, folder on the passenger side, and turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, steady and calm. Patricia thought she'd cornered me, but she'd given me exactly what I needed, proof she was bluffing, and I was done playing her game. The next day, Patricia made her move. A bright orange notice was slapped across my front door like a scarlet letter, bold block letters shouting, "Non-compliance." For anyone walking by, it looked like I was some delinquent neighbor dragging the whole community down. That was the point. Humiliation as punishment. I tore it down and crumpled it in my fist, but the damage was done. Emily had seen it on her way out for school. She didn't say anything, but her silence cut deeper than words. Her shoulders slumped, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. Patricia hadn't just come after me this time. She'd embarrassed my daughter in front of her friends. That was the breaking point. I knew Patricia wanted fear to keep me in line, but instead, it lit a fire under me. After work, I went to the neighborhood clubhouse where the board stored notices on a corkboard for public awareness. Sure enough, my violation letter was pinned dead center. People passing through lingered, reading it with those sideways glances, like I was already guilty. I stood there long enough to feel the weight of their stares before pulling out my phone. I took a clean, full-frame picture of the posting. That wasn't just harassment, it was selective enforcement turned into a spectacle. My engineering mind had already pieced it together. Patricia's authority depended on nobody noticing how she bent the rules. But now, with her going public, she'd given me another angle: defamation and exposure. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of Mark Feldman at the coffee station in the clubhouse. His tie was loose, his eyes darting between me and the board display. He started to raise a hand, then dropped it, stuffing both into his pockets instead. His whole posture screamed conflict, like a man watching a train derail in slow motion, knowing he could pull the brake, but too scared of the fallout. That hesitation told me everything. Mark knew Patricia was in the wrong. He just hadn't decided whether it was worth risking his own seat to admit it. Driving home, I made my choice. No more half measures. No more waiting for Patricia to slip further. I already had her contradictions in writing, and now I had proof she was weaponizing public humiliation. If I didn't push back hard, this wouldn't just end with fines or liens. It would end with Emily believing we were powerless in our own home. I couldn't let that stand. That night, I cleared the dining table and spread out everything: Patricia's letters, the side-by-side bylaw comparisons, the photo of the clubhouse posting. Piece by piece, I was building a case sturdy enough to withstand more than her threats. I poured a cup of coffee, sat down, and started outlining my plan. Step 1. Confirm through county records that the bylaws hadn't been updated. Step 2. Gather neighbors who'd received similar bogus fines. Step 3. Find the exact clause that spelled out the board's limits on enforcement authority. With those 3 pillars, Patricia's entire platform would crumble. Halfway through scribbling notes, I felt a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since this began, the fear shifted. It wasn't mine anymore. It was hers. She just didn't know it yet. I closed the folder and looked over at the tree through the window, its branches moving in the night breeze. My wife had loved that tree, and Patricia wanted it gone. But to me, it was more than roots and leaves. It was memory, it was family, and it was staying. From that moment forward, I wasn't just reacting to Patricia. I was on offense. 2 nights later, I got the message I'd been waiting for, though I hadn't expected it to come so quietly. A slip of paper taped to my mailbox, folded twice, with nothing but my name scrawled across the front. Inside was a single line: "Meet me at the clubhouse back patio after 9. No signature, but I didn't need one. When I showed up, Mark Feldman was already there, pacing in the dim light under the string lamps that buzzed faintly with moths. He looked different without the formality of a board meeting, a man carrying weight he wasn't built for. His shoulders sagged, his jaw worked like he was chewing through words before they escaped. For a long minute, he didn't speak. He just tugged at his tie, loosened it, tightened it again, and finally let it hang crooked, around his neck. His hands went into his pockets, came back out, then rubbed over his face. I stayed quiet, letting him work through it. Finally, he muttered, "She's crossing lines, Daniel. Even I can't defend it anymore." His eyes flicked up to mine, then away. "Patricia? She's been issuing fines from her own drafts. They've never been ratified. The board hasn't approved half of what she sends out." The words hung in the air, heavier than the humid night. It was the confirmation I needed, but hearing it from him, the treasurer, the man who signed off on the accounts, gave it teeth. He leaned on the railing, knuckles white against the wood. "I didn't say this. Understand? I have a family, a mortgage. If she decides I'm against her, she'll make my life hell, just like she's doing to you." His voice cracked a little, and he swallowed hard, as if even admitting it might bring punishment. I nodded, steady. "I don't need you to go public, Mark. I just need you to point me in the right direction." He exhaled sharply, relief and fear mixed together. Then he gave me the detail that changed everything. Patricia wasn't just inventing fines. She was funneling the penalties into a discretionary account she controlled. It wasn't large sums, but it was enough to raise eyebrows if anyone traced the money. My mind raced. This wasn't just procedural overreach. This was potential fraud, And fraud didn't just threaten homeowners, it threatened the entire legitimacy of the association. Mark's eyes darted around the patio, like shadows might be listening. He wiped a bead of sweat from his temple. Check the treasurer's reports filed with the county. Compare them to the internal ledgers. You'll see it. But don't ever say I sent you. I promised him his secret was safe, though I knew eventually Patricia's house of cards would fall hard enough to expose everyone. Still, in that moment, I respected the courage it took for him to step this far out of line. His body language said it all, back hunched, arms wrapped around himself like a shield. Every step of the conversation a fight against his own fear. But he'd crossed the threshold, and once you take that step, there's no going back. As I left the patio, folder under my arm, I felt my plan locking into place. Patricia had her power because she operated in shadows, confident no one would dare shine a light. But now I had the coordinates. The next stage wasn't just about defense, it was about exposing her. I looked back once and saw Mark still on the railing, head down, hands gripping the wood so tight his knuckles looked bone white. He was a man divided, but he'd given me the key I needed. Walking home through the darkened streets, I realized something had shifted permanently. I wasn't alone anymore. Patricia had cracks forming inside her own ranks. And with that kind of fracture, the whole structure could come down with one good push. I spent the weekend building a war room out of my dining table. Papers covered the surface edge to edge. Patricia's letters, my annotated bylaws, photos of the public notices, and now Mark's whispered clue about the ledgers. Each piece was another circuit in a system I was wiring together. And if I connected it right, the current would burn straight through Patricia's false authority. I started with the official treasurer's reports filed at the county office. They were dry spreadsheets, line after line of budget allocations and expenditures. Then I compared them against copies neighbors had tucked away from the last few board meetings. At first glance, they matched, but my training had taught me never to trust the surface. I built a simple script on my laptop, fed both sets of numbers through, and flagged discrepancies. What came back made my stomach knot. Small amounts, scattered across categories like maintenance reserves and administrative adjustments. Nothing blatant. But each of those sums added up, trickling into a slush fund that didn't appear in the county-filed version. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to prove intent. Patricia had created her own shadow account. And Mark was right. She was the only one with control. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow circles above me. Fraud. That word had power. It turned Patricia's crusade from petty tyranny into something that threatened every homeowner's equity. If her scheme ever came to light officially, the HOA's insurance could be compromised and the entire community would be on the hook. That realization shifted my strategy. This wasn't just about defending Emily, or saving a tree, or resisting one woman's obsession with control. This was about protecting the neighborhood from financial collapse, from Patricia gambling with everyone's property values. Sunday afternoon, I called Victor and asked him to come over. When he saw the papers spread across the table, his eyes widened. I walked him through the mismatch penalty schedule, then showed him the discrepancies in the ledgers. He whistled low under his breath. "Daniel, if this gets out, people won't just be angry, they'll demand blood." "That's the point," I said. "Patricia's built her power on fear. But if I can show the community she's been lying, they'll stop listening to her. Fear only works when people believe it's justified." Victor rubbed his jaw, hesitant. "Be careful. People get messy when money's involved, especially when it threatens their homes." I knew he was right, but I also knew this was the leverage I needed. Patricia wanted to paint me as a rule breaker. Instead, I was about to paint her as a liability, a woman jeopardizing the entire community for her own control. That night, I refined my plan. Step 1. Quietly gather allies. Neighbors who'd been fined unfairly. People like Victor who remembered the last legitimate bylaw. Update. Step 2. Prepare a clean presentation with undeniable proof. Step 3. Choose the arena carefully. Patricia thrived in closed-door notices and private intimidation. I'd expose her in the open, where the whole neighborhood could see. I opened my laptop again, this time drafting a timeline of her missteps, the false citations, the fraudulent fines, the public humiliation tactics, and finally, the money trail. By the time I finished, it read less like a dispute and more like a case study in abuse of authority. As I shut it down for the night, I felt a clarity settle over me. Patricia thought she had me trapped in her web, but I was the engineer here, and I'd just mapped every weak joint in her structure. When the moment came, I wouldn't just defend myself. I'd dismantle her system in front of everyone she tried to control. I booked the small conference room at the community center for the afternoon, thinking the neutral space would keep tempers from flaring. When neighbors arrived, it felt less like a meeting and more like a patchwork, people stitched together by frustration and a quiet hunger for change. I set the folder on the table and watched as faces leaned in. Victor, Lena, who'd been fined for her yard arch, Tom from 2 streets over with photos of notices. I opened with the simplest thing, questions. Has anyone else received a notice like this? I tapped Patricia's letter. Hands went up slowly, then more quickly. Stories spilled out, small humiliations, escalating fines, phone calls at odd hours. The pattern was undeniable. Each anecdote deepened the picture. Patricia's enforcement wasn't policing. It was persecution. Then I laid out the hard numbers. I passed around the side-by-side comparisons I'd printed. Patricia's notices on the left, the county bylaws on the right, discrepancies highlighted. There was a hush as people traced the mismatches. When I showed the spreadsheet I'd built, entries flagged where funds didn't align, they leaned forward as if to catch something falling. Lena started to cry, quiet at first, then with a sound that made everyone look away. They pinned that notice to my door, she said. My kids saw it. They asked if we did something wrong. Her voice cracked. No one had an easy answer. We all knew the truth. Patricia had weaponized shame. I explained the plan. We weren't launching a chaotic campaign. We were going to be surgical. Evidence first, witnesses second, a clean presentation third. I'd compiled county records in minutes. Mark's whisper had pointed us to ledgers. Now I needed corroboration, people willing to sign statements, to stand at a meeting and say what had been done to them. Tom handed me an envelope with timestamps and photos of notices nailed to his porch. Victor produced a ledger he'd kept for years, handwritten notes from meetings, amounts, odd entries. Small things, each insignificant alone, became a chain when linked. We divided. Tasks. Lena would contact swim team parents who'd seen Emily's humiliation. Tom would gather dated photos and witness names. Victor would submit formal records requests. I'd collate everything and draft a concise presentation. Someone asked about retaliation. What if Patricia escalated? Fear sat heavy in the room. I didn't pretend otherwise. She'll push back, I said, but the choice isn't between silence and chaos. The choice is whether fear runs our lives or we act together. My voice was steady. People needed that steadiness more than outrage. I taught the group practical things from my toolbox: how to photograph a notice with a visible timestamp, how to log interactions with dates and names, how to archive emails and voicemails without editing them. Technical detail turned emotion into admissible evidence. The room, heavy with anger, lightened with purpose. Neighbors who'd once looked away now took notes, signed forms, volunteered. By late afternoon, we'd collected 5 signed statements in a folder, thick with photos, copies of notices, the bylaw mismatches, and a timeline of enforcement. Momentum mattered more than a perfect plan. People who'd once looked away were now looking at the evidence, and each other. Just before we wrapped, Mark slipped in, haggard but determined. He didn't speak. He nodded and handed me a flash drive. Inside were scanned internal ledgers he'd smuggled. I felt the room tilt. That gesture changed everything. It made the abstract real. Where fear had been a chain, trust had started to be the link that could break it. I felt a cautious hope, like a hinge about to swing open, small but undeniable now. On the sidewalk afterward, Lena gripped the list I'd given her to log incidents. She looked up with something like relief. Tom loaded his envelope into his car. Victor walked with me a few steps and said quietly, "We're not just neighbors anymore. We're a team." We left the community center with boxes in our arms and a plan in our heads. Patricia had set traps for those who stayed quiet. We'd chosen to step into the light. The trap she thought she'd set for us would be the stage where she fell. The county records office smelled faintly of dust and toner, a strange mix of the old and the new. Rows of file cabinets lined the walls, while clerks shuffled papers behind plexiglass windows. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to feel the pulse of a neighborhood battle, but for me, it was the final staging ground. I carried a canvas folder under my arm, its seams straining with statements, photographs, sworn letters, and the neat packet Mark had left folded inside my mailbox. Everything we'd collected, everything we'd endured, it was all condensed into this bundle of proof. The clerk behind the counter glanced up, bored. "Can I help you?" I placed the folder flat on the counter, pressing my palm on it like I was setting down something heavier than paper. "Yes, I need these entered into the record, public access." My voice stayed steady, but inside I felt the weight of every confrontation leading up to this. If Patricia thought she could bury truth inside HOA minutes and private threats, she hadn't counted on the county's open access laws. The clerk shrugged, slid the folder toward herself, and began flipping. Affidavits, photos, meeting notes, witness signatures. She looked at me differently now, eyes sharpening. "You're filing this as an official record of complaint?" "That's right." I leaned in, lowering my voice. "This isn't just me. This is the community. Every page here is a piece of their story." For a moment, silence. Then the clerk stamped the first page with a heavy thud. That sound echoed like a starting gun. Each stamp pinned Patricia's abuses into something permanent, something she couldn't erase with intimidation. The law had memory now, and it wasn't on her side. Walking out of the records office, sunlight hit my face hard and warm. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. But relief wasn't what settled in my chest. It was resolve. Patricia would soon find out the foundation under her control had shifted, and it wasn't shifting back. By late afternoon, I gathered with our core group at a cafe on Main Street. The place buzzed with soft chatter and the hiss of an espresso machine, but at our corner table the energy was sharper. Lila scrolled through her laptop, cross-checking the county's online system. "It's live," she whispered. "Daniel, it's all there. Every line is public." Beside her, Aaron shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief. "You just posted Patricia's sins where anyone can read them. Journalists, city officials, neighbors who've been scared silent. This changes everything." I sipped my coffee, though my hands still trembled faintly from adrenaline. "It doesn't just change everything, it locks it. Patricia can scream all she wants at the meeting, but she can't erase public records." Mark sat apart from the rest, his arms folded, jaw tight. He hadn't spoken since we arrived, and the tension in his shoulders was like a live wire. When our eyes met, he finally muttered, "You've forced my hand." His voice carried both resentment and something that sounded like relief. "If she knows I helped, I'm finished." I leaned toward him, keeping my tone low. "Mark, you've already taken the risk. What you slipped me was enough to prove the financial manipulation. If you stay quiet now, the record speaks for you. If you stand up when the time comes, it'll mean even more. But either way, you're not alone." He rubbed his forehead, eyes darting to the cafe window where a group of neighbors walked past. "Not alone," he repeated, almost testing the words. Then he let out a long, shuddering breath. That night, back home, I spread copies of every file across my kitchen table. The pages looked almost ceremonial under the dim light, a paper barricade against Patricia's empire. I thought of my father and the promise I'd made when he signed this property over to me, that no one would ever strip its worth, or the dignity tied to it. Patricia's threats had crossed into that sacred ground, and now I was standing where I was meant to stand, not as a lone neighbor with a grievance, but as the one holding the line. I whispered it out loud, steady and final. "Tomorrow, it all comes out." The walls seemed to hold the words for me, like the house itself had been waiting to hear them. The records were filed, the allies were ready, and the stage was set. Patricia believed she controlled the narrative, but she'd soon face something far more powerful than control, truth dragged into the light where everyone could see. And the light was already spilling in. The clubhouse smelled of lemon polish and tension. Every folding chair was filled, neighbors pressed shoulder to shoulder, some even standing along the back wall. I felt the air vibrating with something restless, like a storm about to break. Patricia sat at the front table, gavel in hand, lips drawn into a tight smile that didn't touch her eyes. Her voice rang out sharp as glass. "This meeting will come to order. We'll be addressing multiple violations tonight, including the incident at the pool." She looked directly at me as if daring me to flinch. I didn't. I stood near the center aisle, binder tucked under my arm, my fingers wrapped so tight around it that my knuckles ached. Inside that binder was every piece of proof I'd gathered: affidavits, photos, timelines, even a notarized statement from Emily about what Patricia had done. I didn't plan on just defending myself. I planned on exposing her entire house of cards. The room shifted when Mark walked in late, avoiding Patricia's eyes. He slid into a chair on the board's side, shoulders hunched, his hands folded so tightly his knuckles whitened. He didn't speak, but his body betrayed him. He looked trapped, like a man standing on a fence while the ground crumbled beneath both sides. Patricia launched into her litany, calling out homeowners for trash cans left a few hours too long, hedges trimmed an inch short, mailboxes in need of fresh paint. The neighbors muttered among themselves, weariness painted on every face. By the time she moved to my name, the air was thick with unease. And finally, Daniel Cross, who has allowed non-compliant swimwear in the pool area, putting the community at risk for liability. Her gavel struck the table like a verdict. This cannot be tolerated. The room broke into whispers. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with fear. I let the silence stretch, then stepped forward. Before we continue, I said, my voice steady but carrying, I need to remind everyone that this board doesn't have the authority Patricia claims it does. I set the binder down on the table with a heavy thud. And I can prove it. Patricia's smile faltered. You're out of order. No, I cut in, holding up a document. What's out of order is an HOA attempting to enforce rules without proper filings. County law requires updated records of incorporation and amendments for enforcement. This board hasn't filed a single one in 7 years. I slid copies down the table toward the other board members. Gasps rippled through the crowd, like wind through dry leaves. Patricia's face reddened. That's a gross misinterpretation. It's not, I said firmly. And if anyone doubts me, here are certified copies from the county records office. I handed them to a neighbor in the front row, letting the papers travel through their hands. The murmurs grew louder, the tide shifting. I could feel Mark's eyes on me. His lips parted, but he didn't speak. Instead, he adjusted his glasses, his hands trembling just enough for those nearby to notice. He wanted to say something. I saw the war waging inside him, but fear nailed him to his seat. Patricia slammed the gavel again. This is a smear campaign. He's twisting facts to undermine order. I took a step closer to her table, lowering my voice so that every person leaned forward to hear. You dragged my daughter out of the pool over a swimsuit strap. You embarrassed her, traumatized her, and you did it while wielding authority you don't legally have. That's not order. That's abuse. My words cut through the room like a blade. A neighbor in the back shouted, "He's right. You've been targeting people for years." Another chimed in. My citation was bogus too. The room buzzed with outrage, voices rising one after another. Patricia pounded the gavel so hard the handle cracked, but she couldn't drown them out. She couldn't control them anymore. Mark finally shifted in his chair. His hand hovered above the microphone before pulling back. His forehead glistened with sweat. I caught his eyes, gave the smallest nod. He swallowed, then leaned forward, voice breaking the chaos. He's telling the truth. The filings are missing. I've seen the notices come in. The room went silent, every eye snapping toward him. His admission hung heavy, a crack splitting open the facade Patricia had built. Patricia turned on him, her face twisted in fury. Mark, you're undermining the board. But it was too late. The damage was done. Neighbors rose to their feet, voices surging again, this time unified, this time demanding answers. Patricia shouted, but her words drowned under the tide. She'd lost them, and she knew it. I stood there, my chest tight but steady, watching the power slip through her fingers. For the first time since this fight began, I knew the end was within reach. The truth wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone in that room. The next morning, the clubhouse parking lot was nearly empty, but the echoes of last night's storm still lingered. Word had traveled faster than Patricia could contain it. Neighbors who'd once avoided eye contact now stopped by my house with nods of gratitude. Some bringing coffee, others just standing a little taller, knowing someone had finally pushed back. Patricia hadn't resigned yet, but her authority was gone. Without filings, without credibility, she was a queen without a crown, and everyone knew it. I walked down to the pool with Emily, her small hand gripping mine. The morning sun scattered diamonds across the water's surface. For the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a place of memory, of love. My wife's laughter seemed to echo in the ripples, faint but steady, reminding me why I'd fought in the first place. This wasn't just about a strap on a swimsuit. It was about dignity, about legacy, about ensuring no one could trample the memories we'd built together. Emily knelt by the edge, dipping her toes in. "Does this mean she can't bother us anymore?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. I crouched beside her, letting the cool water run through my fingers. "It means she can't decide the rules anymore, not without the community's say." She nodded, a smile breaking across her face. It was the first real smile I'd seen on her since that day Patricia dragged her out. That alone was worth every late night, every risk. Later that week, the board reconvened without Patricia's gavel pounding down on them. Neighbors filled the seats again, but this time the energy was different, lighter, braver. People spoke without fear of reprisal. They questioned policies, asked for transparency, demanded accountability. Mark sat stiffly at the front, pale but resolute. He didn't look at me, but his voice carried a different weight now when he admitted the filings hadn't been kept. It wasn't an apology, but it was a step. He'd chosen truth over silence, and that mattered. The board voted to suspend enforcement until records could be updated. More importantly, they opened the floor for nominations. Hands shot up across the room. People who'd been quiet for years now volunteering to serve. Patricia's shadow had ruled over them for too long, and now it was lifting. I didn't put my name forward, but I knew I didn't need to. This fight had never been about power. It was about restoring balance. Others were ready to carry that torch. When I left the meeting, a neighbor I barely knew clapped me on the shoulder. "You gave us our voice back," he said. His words stuck with me all the way home, because he wasn't just talking about bylaws or violations. He was talking about courage, about standing tall even when the ground feels unsteady. That night, I sat by the pool alone, listening to the quiet hum of the filter, watching the reflection of the stars on the water. My wife had always believed this place was more than concrete and chlorine. To her, it was where Emily learned to swim, where summer laughter stitched neighbors together, where joy outweighed the weight of loss. I felt her presence in the stillness, proud and steady. I whispered into the night. I kept the promise. And for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. Patricia might try to claw her way back, but the community had seen the truth. Fear doesn't hold when it's exposed to light. And the light was everywhere now, in every neighbor who refused to be silenced, in every child splashing freely without scrutiny, in every homeowner who knew they had a right to their voice. She couldn't put that genie back in the bottle. None of them could. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. Because this fight isn't just mine. It belongs to all of us who refuse to bow to bullies in positions of power. And together, we're stronger than any gavel could ever be.